Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we are joined by Jordan Hall. He is the co-founder of the GameB community. He is the co-founder and executive chairman of the Neurohacker Collective and is now focusing on the Civium project. Jordan, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's nice to be here.
Absolutely. So we've been doing a wide assortment of stuff, and there's a lot of people who are in the Startup Society space that are probably pretty familiar with what's going on with GameB, or at least have heard the term. But and a lot of your work sort of revolves around that. But for our listeners, they're probably mostly interested in stuff related to special zones, alternative governance, intentional communities. How does what you're working on at Civium or your previous work relate to those sorts of topics?
Sure. So maybe there's three things to bound that. In the context of the GameB conversation, one of the sub areas, which is the one that I focused on the most, was called Deep Code. And the intent there was to do a very deep dive as rapidly and as deeply as possible into what do we know about the underlying basis of how civilization itself works across the entire scheme of what it even means for something to be a civilization, like enculturation and language development, like the whole thing. And the point there being is that we'd like to not be particularly random in what we're doing, right? The point of theory is that if you get a theory right, it narrows the search space of what kinds of things to practice so that your likelihood of actually being successful is potentially much, much higher. And so Deep Code did its thing, and we spent a good 10 years on that. Now, coming out the other side of it, there's still work to be done, but there's a lot of theory. And now an important next move is to begin the process of actually trying to do it, trying to embody that theory in practice, both because the practice will give us more clarity on the theory in a way that purely theoretical work can't, and also because the actual doingness of it is the point in the first place. And we're obviously quite ripe, right? This is something that last point I think is something that is will be well acknowledged or strongly believed by your listeners, which is that the time for an alternative approach to how people live together and how we structure our societies has probably never been riper.
Before we move too much further, can you give a 2-sentence definition of what GameB is for those who aren't fully aware of the definition?
No, I can't give a 2-sentence. Like maybe do a paragraph and a half.
Paragraph and a half is good.
Okay. So the notion is, hey, there's something wrong with the way that our society is unfolding. Oh, it turns out that we can understand what that is and why that is. It turns out it's really deep and old. I call that Game A. Everything that we've ever done under the heading of civilization has been running the Game A operating system. They're all variations on the theme. We can now predict that anything running the Game A operating system will show up with the same kind of instability and fragility events. Okay, if we want to build something or we want to live in something that is not inexorably self-terminating, then we have to design it on a completely different basis. That basis will be Game B. Now, what is that? What is the content of that? Therein lies the Deep Code project.
Okay, perfect. And you were just describing how Deep Code is related to your other projects, including Civium.
Yep. Yeah. So Game B asks the question in many sense, what is Game B? Deep Code then begins to investigate the space of what that could be. It has a lot of theory around it. Civium is now, okay, how do we actually begin to try to live Game B, noticing that we can only do so by living it, and we will ultimately end up discovering it as much as we design it.
Okay, awesome. And so what are some of the conclusions of Deep Code that are being implemented or at least pondered in the Civium project?
Sure. So let me two, like big Roman numerals. The first is a derivative or comes from, or at least the insight came to me from the work by Jeffrey West and Louise Betancourt at the Santa Fe Institute, which their book Scale, or Jeffrey's book Scale, points to. But what I'm about to say is my own, but it came to me after contemplating their stuff for, since 2005. What they noticed was that there was a in the world, two kinds of scaling metrics. One is effectively a linear scaling metric. So if I have like a brick that weighs a pound, and then I scale it up to 10 bricks, they weigh 10 pounds. The second, which is dominant in living systems, is a sublinear scaling metric. So for example, if I have an animal that weighs 10 pounds and has X amount of metabolism, however you'd like to measure it, and I grow that animal to 20 pounds, I double it. I don't double the metabolic rate. I actually increase the metabolic rate by 0.85. And this fact of a sublinear scaling metric associated with living systems, on the one hand, is massive in defining what living systems are and how they fit into the larger context of physics, of reality, and shows up all over the place. Luis and Jeffrey began expanding and looking in other places. They started looking at forests, and they started looking at human-designed environments, and they found that corporations are governed by a lot of the same dynamics. The corporations are very close to living organisms. So for example, if I add an additional employee to an organization like Google, I don't get the same amount of revenue per employee, or specifically I don't get the same amount of innovation per employee. It's basically an asymptotic curve. So as everybody knows who's been in startup land, those first 30 or 40 employees have a massive amount of innovation. And then after that, you start getting people who are kind of managing the process and exploiting the energy that was contained in the original potential, but the degree of innovation per additional person tends to decrease.
It becomes an institution.
It becomes an institution, exactly. Now, here's the move. What they discovered was that cities don't have that characteristic, that cities actually have a superlinear scaling exponent. I would just read their book, but I'm trying to brush through it, which is to say that if I have a city, and for example, metrics like income per capita and patents per capita, so wealth and innovation, are superlinear scaling. So if I have a city like, say, Tokyo, and let's say everybody has, this isn't right, but let's say for simple math, everybody makes $10,000 a month, and there's 1 million people in the city. If I just double the population, I will actually not keep the amount of income per capita constant. It'll go up. It'll actually go up to 11,500. So it increases, it's a 1.15. Now, that's a little bit of artificial precision. It's not exactly that, but it's shocking how many systems that have the superlinear scaling tend to be around 1.15. But the point is superlinear scaling. And so what that means is, if I double the population, the income per capita goes up. Okay. Now think through the implications of that. The implication is, every city wants to absorb as many human beings as it possibly can, right? This is an attractor. If I can get from 2 million people to 4 million people, I get another hit in income per capita, which now, of course, is an even larger number in terms of total income flowing through the city. I also get a hit in innovation per capita, right? So in some sense, there's an attractor towards singularity, right? In some sense, the city as a construct wants to pull all humans into a single giant megalopolis. Okay, now here's the Deep Code. Deep Code started there, so let me continue to run down this front. But that hasn't happened for very straightforward reasons, which is that on the one hand, I have an attractor. On the other hand, I have a series of repulsive effects. I'm using kind of physics metaphors in the sun, right? Gravity and electromagnetism. The repulsive effects are things like, the minimum human bodies have 3-dimensional requirements. So I can't squeeze all humans into a single point, singularity meant in the center. There has to be some space, but of course that space requires things like flows of food and flows of water, right? So the constraint was my technical capacity, or our technical capacity, to provide the minimum requirements of livingness, multiplied by the ability to actually get as many bodies into a space as possible. So things like transportation and water and food and energy. Every time there was an iteration in that, so for example, the invention of the elevator, which allowed space to no longer be constrained by 2 dimensions, it allowed us to go vertical, radically increase the capacity to squeeze more bodies into cities, right? So there's a history in some sense, and this again, Tyson Yockel-Porter has said the same thing, which blew my mind when I read it. We can almost say that the history of civilization is in fact the history of the city endeavoring to figure out how to extract as much from a big environment, as much of a footprint as it can get, to squeeze as many bodies into a urban accumulation as it can. With every subsidiary city in an empire, for example, like the Roman Empire, actually being part of the support structure of Rome itself, and everything, the entire footprint, can be seen as like a vascular system pulling into the single brain at the center, which is Rome. So Metcalfe's law had to do with the value of a telephone network, having to do with the fact that the more nodes, the more people, or at least potential communication you attach to a communications network, the value of the network increases exponentially. And so, for example, if you have something like Facebook, there's a tendency of Metcalfe law-driven systems like social media to collapse into monopolies. So there aren't 5 social media platforms. There's sort of just Facebook, and then sometimes there's topologically different ones like Twitter, which are almost like a different niche, and there's just one Twitter in the Twitter niche. And this is because that value increases exponentially. And so, once you get past a small number of people, that's a lot of differential. Between 10 people and 100 people is a much bigger number of value. Okay, so the theory here is that the dynamics of the city that I was just describing, are really an artifact of the fact that the intelligence in the world thus far has been in the form of embodied humans. And so if the way that you get the maximum amount of intelligence coordinated around a communications network is you have to get embodied humans into sort of walking, or at least transportation distance of each other so they can have face-to-face conversations, then obviously you have to gather them into the cities in whatever density they can endure, and that gets you the maximum value, right? That's the old-fashioned communications network. And as telecommunications actually begin to unfurl, you have a trade-off between the bandwidth of the communications, like a telegraph network has a very low bandwidth, and the amount of people you can communicate with. Right? So you get these really interesting mesh overlays where a telephone network on the one is sort of a meta city within the narrow band of symmetric small end communications, whereas something like New York is a city in the context of high bandwidth, 10 to 12 people in a room, fully embodied, right? So there's like different variations in the primary theme of how do I get the maximum number of intelligences connected to the same network.
So I guess the question I would have is from 2 different perspectives. One, from the perspective of an investor, and 2, in terms of a person who is trying to live a better life. And if they have the opportunity to invest in a network that could have this type of monopoly, operates under the same law, or a city that also scales according to the same law, which one do you think? Which out of these opportunities do you think the investor would gain most, financial value out of? And then the follow-up question: the individual is trying to live a good life. If they wanted to invest a lot of their energy in creating a community online versus in the city, if they have to choose one, which one would get the most utility?
Awesome. So can I slice that Gordian knot for you?
Yeah, please do.
So this actually gets us to the Civium. Before I get there, before I answer your question, that's exactly the right question. Let me just go to this Roman numeral 2 for this other deep concept, which I think I could do faster. So we just did the concept of Metcalfe's law and cities and all that kind of crap. Okay, let's do now a distinction between an economy of growth and an economy of increase. And here I'm referencing a particular individual named Tyson Yunkaporta, who's the one who first brought this into my mind. So the metaphor he uses is that an economy of growth is like, I want to get smarter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grow the number of neurons in my brain, and I'm just going to get a bigger brain. And it's a little bit like growing GDP. I'm just going to increase the size of the economy. The notion of increase, distinguishing growth versus increase. And this concept of increase would be to say, all right, I want to get smarter. What I'll do is I'll keep the number of neurons constant, but I will increase the quality of my synaptic connections, which is to say both. I will increase the degree to which the right synapses are talking with each other, and I will increase the quality of the connectivity between the synapses. Okay, now let's just merge these 2 ideas together. If the notion of Metcalfe's law and the driver of these networks is driven around this notion that as the number of people or the number of intelligences connected to the communication networks increases, the value of the network increases exponentially. What I'd like to say is that's actually around a growth version, which is the potential of the network increases exponentially, not the actual value. So for example, if I've got 1 million people in a city, in actual reality for you, there's only still a very finite number of relationships that you can have, a finite number of conversations, finite number of conversations, and a finite amount of attentional bandwidth that you have with which to organize those conversations into relationships. That actually ends up being more important. So if I passed at a certain threshold. So if I go flip to the other side to the notion of increase, the increase model would be to say, okay, cool, let's take a look at this. Up to some n, which is to say some space of potential, the actual way to get the highest amount of actual value is to focus on how do I optimize both the quality of the relationship, the quality of the communication that's happening inside the communications network. And this, again, has to do with simultaneously who is in relationship with whom, what's the quality of their capacity for relationship, the sort of what's the competence in relationality on either side of the relationship. And by the way, what's the orienting basis for them to focus on the aspect of the relationship that has the highest value? Those are the 3 distinct variables for optimizing for increase. Okay, so take those concepts, now apply it to your question. So if I'm just looking at it from the point of view of growth, I'll be looking for the kinds of things like, okay, well, what can grow the fastest? And I'll tend to focus on something like Facebook, right? Because the virtual environment can grow much faster than the physical environment. Well, then I might also look and say, well, yes, that's true, but the value per person tends to be higher in the physical environment because I'm dealing with the whole of their economic value. Whereas in Facebook, I'm dealing with the subsets. So I could kind of cross those 2 numbers and I'd be doing that kind of analytics.
So
of course, all of this leaves your second question on the side, like what's the quality of life?
Right.
Okay, so the Civium proposal, this by the way is the content of my first video on Civium, is to slice those 2 in half and say, okay guys, for the very first time, we have a theoretical basis for why it's important and useful to decouple these 2 domains. And if you do it, something very interesting happens. So render unto the virtual what is virtual, and render unto the physical what is physical. So the short answer is both, and they should always be done both, never separately. So what ends up happening is you get this really interesting dynamic. On the one hand, at the virtual level, you would, if you design the virtual level on the right theoretic basis, i.e. you don't design Facebook, how do I say this, pragmatically driven by the exigencies of the existing market concepts, but you actually look at it and say, what's the most solid, scalable foundation against which everything else will grow? Then you'll be building a virtual city, a virtual communications network to which every consciousness, every mind, human and non-human, will eventually be attracted. So the right virtual attractor will in fact be a singular point, and it will contain all, although it'll also by definition, by the way, be heterogeneous. And again, there's a vast amount of theory, but there's a reason why that would be the case. So it's not going to be, it can't not be a homogeneous whole.
When you're quote unquote designing a city or an operating system, this is something that I've seen in GameB community, and I could be frankly, because I'm not as well versed as I should be, but it seems that there's a lot of focus on, I know this isn't a GameB project, but it seems in the same vein, that there's tremendous energy in designing a culture or designing a community. But for something as emergent as a city or even a social network, trying to come with a top-down sort of framework versus allowing it to emerge, do you think that the results would be better, or do you think they could potentially be worse due to the unintended consequences of creating a top-down framework or even a foundational framework that's so consciously designed?
Well, the answer, of course, is both. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So let's take a look at the threshold event that happened between chemistry and biology. All right, so, and this stuff has been studied a lot. Stuart Kauffman is a key name in that dynamic. So at the level of complex chemistry, right, so I'm talking about the stochastic consequences of molecules bumping into each other, and the relationship, the consequences of catalysts and certain concentrations that just happen because of physical environment. So if I have a physical caldera that happens to concentrate chemistry that accelerates the probability of interactions. The likelihood that a given DNA strand will perfectly replicate itself just through sheer complex chemistry borders on zero. Right? Just the sheer likelihood that a series of nucleotides arranged in a certain arrangement, if I just kind of pour a bunch of amino acids into a soup, the likelihood that I'll get another one of exactly the same code is nearly zero. And yet, if I change the landscape to one that has DNA, RNA, and a lipid membrane in which the DNA and RNA are operating, I actually am able to flip that likelihood to bordering on 100%, right? A very high number of nines. And then, of course, I can build multicellular organisms. That sense of a design constraint, right? The notion of, okay, I need DNA, and what I mean by DNA is this kind of design constraint on information processing, and I need RNA, and I need cellular membranes. I need this kind of toolkit of fundamental characteristics in certain kinds of relationships. It gives rise to a shift in the probabilistic landscape of the bottoms up, right? The bottoms up is still the bottoms up, right? At the end of the day, my cellular matrix is operating in the context of complex chemistry. If I look at the inside of a cell, it's still molecules bouncing against each other. But what I've done is I've so radically changed the probability landscape of the stochastic behaviors that I've moved something, the replication of DNA, from almost impossible to almost certain. That's the sweet spot. All right. So we're not talking about top-down design in the blueprint sense, where you're trying to actually specify and constrain the exact location of each molecule. Like think like atomic scale 3D printing. That ain't the thing. Mm-hmm. It's designing the design constraints, designing the milieu of architecture that shifts the probability landscape, in this case of human behavior, so that the likelihood of the human behavior reliably landing on a particular frontier is orders of magnitude higher. Like in this case, something like 100 orders of magnitude higher. So
you're not designing the rules, you're designing the rules to design the rules.
You've got it. You're designing the generator function. And we can think about it kind of like this. Like if you just do the metaphor that I just used, complex chemistry to genotype, phenotype, okay? Now just say culture, every culture, all of culture that we've developed thus far, since humans have been a cultural species, is a little bit like complex chemistry. Right? In some sense, it's a random search through culture space, constrained by the various constraints that enable certain cultures to cohere and thrive and survive, and other cultures to evaporate or get destroyed. GameB is to say, okay, there's a location in culture space, just like the first DNA, RNA cell or cellular membrane was a location in complex chemistry space. There's a location in culture space where the evolution of culture moves from a random evolutionary process into a completely different kind of process, which is exactly the same as this movement from complex chemistry into cells. Do you follow that?
Generally. Could you explain it in a little bit more detail?
Let me see if I can say it in a different way. Okay, we'll have to use a different metaphor. So let's now move from the metaphor of complex chemistry to the metaphor of life. And what we're going to do is the threshold between life and behavior. Right? So now what I have is I have a whole bunch of biological organisms evolving. Right? They're just evolving in nature. You've got all the various sort of constraints that evolutionary theories looked at. One of the things that exists in that particular milieu is this notion of a neuron. Now, if we zoom in on a neuron, what we can say is that a neuron is a particular kind of complex chemistry that has this characteristic of regularly, and by the way, energetically efficiently, responding to inputs with discrete outputs. Does that make sense? So what it does is it creates a state map. Oh, sorry, keep going.
So discrete, define discrete in this sense.
So it's like an if-then. If A, then if one, then A, if two, then B, or just if X, then Y. All right. And so it takes what might be either a random response graph or a noisy response graph and turns it into a vastly more precise. In this case, just in our hypothetical, it's just a branch. It's just an if-then statement. So for example, in an early neural cell, if photon gradient is stronger in this direction, then move the entire organism in that direction. So the neural cell, the photoreceptor, has the capacity as an instance of complex chemistry constrained by RNA DNA to generate this if-then statement, which we now can call behavior. Right? So organic life, which in some sense is this sort of, in the context of behavior, is like complex chemistry in the context of life. It's somewhat random. It's just sort of moving around in the milieu, sometimes succeeding, sometimes not succeeding. Once you start seeing the development of neurons, which is just a collapse of how complex chemistry operates with regard to physical inputs and physical outputs, into a system that has this very clean, if a certain gradient of photons is above a certain threshold, then trigger this regularly reliable response, which then can be perceived by the rest of the organism to trigger a whole systemic response, which means move, right? Move towards the light. That's a
how is this
massive change.
How is this different from a constitution? Because there's a lot of if-then statements associated with the Constitution.
Nice.
If there's a law that is passed in the House and it goes to the other House of Congress, then it goes to the president, et cetera. But that's still
Mundo. So that same move, right? The move from pre-behavioral, mind-driven or neurologically driven biological life using strictly stochastic evolutionary process to behavioral-driven process, then has another threshold event embodied by human. Right? So culture you're talking about, the Constitution is a variation on culture. And culture is exactly what you're talking about, right? It uses the ability to generate much more precise symbolic characters, in this case, language, to generate a if-then model, if-then map that can coordinate a body politic. Right? So now instead of trying to coordinate a single body, I'm now trying to coordinate a coherent body politic, and that's a huge advantage. And if I can do division of labor into a very large number of distinct humans and allow each one to sub-optimize or slightly optimize or fully optimize for particular subdomains of what is needed in the overall human journey and maintain the integrity of that group as a whole, I get this massive synergy value. Right? So the Constitution is like the DNA. Yeah, you follow me?
I am, but what are the practical implications of this? Because clearly, at least our listeners, and I assume yourself, don't want to replicate the same problems with the Constitution. You tend to have these problems of rules that don't make sense right now.
Here's where your mind gets blown. This is the part that I think is very difficult to hold, but at least we have the metaphors in place. So I said that DNA, RNA, cell is in relationship to complex chemistry. And then I said a metaphor. I said that the neuron is to life what DNA was to chemistry. Okay, and then I said culture is to life what life was to, culture is to neurology, to behavior what behavior was to chemistry. To DNA. Right, you follow me on those steps?
Yeah.
GameB is to culture what culture was to behavior. It's a complete level up. It's not another variation on the theme of culture. That's game A. Game A is any variation on the theme of culture. Game B is a completely different threshold event where the notion of the sort of random search through culture space for things that are slightly more effective than others actually is able to operate in a space where it is able to rapidly iterate towards a optimal graph that has that stands in relationship to the previous environment, like the previous environment stood to itself. So game B stands in relationship to game A, stands in relationship to civilization, as civilization stood to biological life.
So either this is a world-breaking social innovation, or it's the new Tower of Babel. Why is it the former?
It's actually both, but it's the inverse Tower of Babel.
Okay.
It's funny because like that metaphor of the Tower of Babel turns out to be super powerful.
Because the reason I make it is because it kind of sounds like a lot of social experiments like Esperanto. The idea of trying to create an ideal language based on all sorts of different languages. And obviously the difference between Esperanto and this is he came with a pre-packaged language, Esperanto, and then developed a community around it, versus you're saying that you're creating sort of the meta rules that allows people to create these new rules through culture.
Yeah.
But it seems the
That's the key.
artificial nature of it is kind of
Yeah, well, let's just use, we can use your example to prove the point. So Esperanto operates at the level of language. Right? Google Translate operates at the level of meta language. And I don't know if you saw the study that actually showed that when the machine learning process of Google Translate discovered that the easiest way to do its job was actually to construct a meta language. So it didn't translate from English to French. It translated from English to the meta language and from the meta language back down to French, which is both more efficient and more accurate. That's the move. Like, that's it. It's not, in some sense, it's not, how do you say it? It's simple. It's really, really hard to do, but it's simple once you get it. There's a move where you can go to a meta structure. In this case, by the way, you have to actually go to a meta structure, but God, don't ask me to go there. That's going to get really gobbledygooky. But in any event, you go to a meta structure. In the meta structure, all the things that have happened at the level of the basic structure now have a very different set of dynamics. So you don't create Esperanto, you create a meta language, and you create a protocol that enables any given instantiation, any given language, to be translated into the characteristics at the level of the meta language and then translated back down into any given other instantiation. And we're very familiar with this in the context of the internet, right? If you build a protocol like say HTTP and HTML, you can have an arbitrarily large number of websites, but you can have just a web browser that's able to interact with all the websites. So each website is an instantiation of the basic toolkit of what's available, and you have interoperability across the entire internet. Fortunately, much of the theoretical work in terms of how do you build scalable communications protocols that enable an arbitrarily large amount of heterogeneity and specificity while maintaining compatibility has been done at the level of the internet. And by the way, I should say that the internet we currently operate on is like about a 3% of the whole sphere. Like, the amount of thinking that's been done around these kinds of protocols is a lot larger. We just have only implemented certain pieces, certain aspects. So the challenge in the GameB environment is actually how do we do a meta move, which is to translate a lot of the work that's been done in domains like the internet, and many, many others, by the way, into an even higher order language, which we can then fully instantiate down into the wholeness of livingness. And that's the Civium project, right? Now we're at a place where we can actually begin the process of designing villages and towns, and beginning to look at how those particularly have economies, some of which operate at the virtual level, some of which operate at the lived level, and how they enter into relationship with each other.
Okay, so maybe now it would make a good sense to go down to the nitty-gritty. How does this formulation of the idea of these meta rules, how does it, practically instantiate itself within the Civium project, within initiatives that you're moving forward on?
Great. So there's a bunch. I can just give you a handful, and mostly it ends up looking like design constraints. So here's characteristics of what a valid Civium looks like. So an example is a valid Civium must contain a set of protocols that cover what I call, we go up to the meta level. A valid Civium must consider, or must contemplate, the ontological design, must contemplate the culture design, and must contemplate the socio-technical design. Right? Ontological design covers the space of the kind of the physicality of livingness, like how do we get food, how do we move energy, how do we do transportation, housing, all that stuff. Cultural design, obviously, mostly around human development and interrelationship at the bottom, and the socio-technical scales with essentially agreements. How do we operate all the various agreements that drive all these systemic dynamics in the sense of a constitution? Okay, so all three of those modes, and by the way, that's enough. Once you've got all three of those in place with the right amount of breadth, you've got a complete system. Now, it does it first at the level of protocols. So you have to have a series of design constraints that sort of a set of questions. What's the full set of questions that must be answered to actually have a complete design across these three dimensions? And notice, by the way, that let's just zoom in on the ontological design dimension. So if I look at the ontological design dimension, I've got a whole bunch of questions. I've asked a few. Where do we live? How do we get our food? How do we address energy? And the questions recognize that the synthetic or the integration of all those questions is itself part of the question space. So I can't just do a strictly analytic process. I can't solve for energy without noticing that then my solution for energy has intrinsic implications for all the other questions in the design space, right? So I have to actually run a process which is able to ask each question, begin coming up with, what the hell is called, candidate solutions, but then actually migrate the candidate solutions through the different domains to see whether or not they throw up errors. But eventually I can actually evolve that process through a series of iterations into a holistic systems design that actually is sort of a valid answer to the broad question of ontological design. Equally, in the ontological design space, I have a series of operating heuristics that guide the design constraints. So one, for example, has to do with autochthony or indigenousness. So a given civium should, to the maximum extent possible, operate using the content of the bioregion in which it is operating. So almost an organic or biomimicry metaphor. So a civium that's operating in the open ocean will have a very distinct basis for how it answers that set of questions than a civium that's operating in Cascadia, because each one of which is instantiated in the actual, must be conceptually instantiated in the context of its actual bioregion. So do you see how that's a design constraint? I actually have to think about those as my questions must be answered using this toolkit to the maximum extent possible. Then, right, so I've got this sort of downward movement in the ontological design mode, which has a whole series of questions and a process for iterating across those sets of questions to get to something which is a holistic system with a series of heuristics, including autochthonous. Then, of course, I have to think about the other two modes. I have to think about the socio-technical mode and the cultural mode. It's similar in nature, right? The cultural mode has a series of questions. It has a series of heuristics, the socio-technical, and then, of course, the integration across all three has to happen. So there's an intrinsic wholeness that has to happen. So at the top level, like that meta-meta level, this idea of wholeness, you think about it organically. A civium is best understood as like a seed crystal or a seed that is planted in the native soil, the bioregion, and the indigenous human milieu that it's actually dropped into. Then it has to have a mechanism for attracting more resources, which is to say human beings and material, into its environment and growing. Right? It grows organically. It has to scale from its central point. And of course, the meta protocol or the protocol that gives rise to the set of questions maintains the ability to actually have compatibility between the two. Right? So if you've got a cultural system, I've got a cultural system, you've got a cultural system, there's a mechanism for verifying that you can actually translate up from your cultural system because it's satisfied this whole set of design constraints, abstract it, slide it over, and then translate it back down into my cultural system. And we basically can do a Google Translate between the two.
So a lot of these principles, they sound, I mean, I'm sure they're backed by some experience, but they sound very a priori. But I would imagine that the science of making a community is very a posteriori versus a priori. So what is being done to get feedback that these assumptions are correct, that these are the correct meta rules to be implementing in different communities?
Well, at the end of the day, you've really just got three methods, right? You've got a kind of an academic historical method. So you can take a look at all the different efforts that have ever been done to build human communities and see how they actually did what they did, and see if there are situations where like long-standing rules tended to show up. The other direction, of course, is you can operate at the scientific level and start looking for things like which are a priori, sociological theories of human behavior. Fourth generation cognitive science is one of the more important here. But physics and biology are important too. They can give you sort of here's what we think is just the nature of human nature, or the nature of how human beings or systems in general operate, and drop them down. And then the third is you can actually take a look at entering into dialogue with those particular kinds of human communities that have what I would call wisdom. So indigenous communities in particular that have been around for tens of thousands of years, not for hundreds of years. And have an awareness of what are in fact these long-standing, enduring rules. These things that have actually really worked for a very long period of time. Things that show up as working in general for reasonable periods of time, but across lots of different contexts. And then things that in theory should be part of any system that has endurance built into it. Those are the three. That's it. That's all you can do. And it's either has been done or is in the process of being done continuously as we continue to unfold. Then the last thing, of course, is experiments. You just have to begin dropping it into real lived environments and begin to see what works and what doesn't work.
And at what point do you see you trying the latter route? towards
right now.
Right now, okay. I'd love to hear it.
That's why it's called the Civium project. So Deep Code was the project that said, look, dude, there's really it's sort of, I get the notion that sitting and thinking for a long time can be frustrating to people who are biased towards action. But at the same time, when you're trying to do something hard, just randomly rushing into things tends to be both a waste of time and energy, and oftentimes leads to havoc. Let's see if we can spend enough time on theory to have a clue, but not a whole lot more than a clue, just a clue. Once we got to the point where that was, okay, we have a clue, now we're dropping into what is essentially the hard work, which may take a while. And that's the Civium project. So the Civium project is, when you want to understand, it's that, right? It's that movement. So in terms of right now, now's all the stuff that your listeners are extraordinarily familiar with. Let's take a look at what are the various economic models around acquiring property in different jurisdictions around the world. Is it in fact actually efficient? I had a recent video where I talked about the conversations I've been having with the team behind Oceanics. I'm sure you're familiar with them.
Yes.
So you can start looking at land reclamation at the borders that has to do with the regulatory environment. So I've got, okay, where do I get permission to build certain kinds of things? What's the economics that drives it right now? What's the kind of attractor states that brings in people who are kind of homesteaders? What are the value fields that bring in the right kinds of people? Like, this was one of the challenges that happened with your steed-setting movement, was that the value field attracted a particular subset of people, but didn't attract other subsets of people, and the kind of the ignition, the ability to actually get the fuel to cause the engine to turn over, well, so far at least has not been able to get to criticality. Whereas by contrast, for example, the city of Denver is a perfectly functional city. I keep trying to bring this to people's minds, and I'm sure you get frustrated with it too, which I say, hey, look, human beings have built new towns and cities throughout history, and every town and city you've ever been to was founded in the United States not that fucking long ago. So it's not sort of that crazy to think about creating a whole bunch of new ones, but there is a difference. Like certain ingredients have to be there. So economic models, actually the real, like hiring lawyers and doing the regulatory work, looking at what are the variables for being able to work with land use. For that matter, and by the way, this is largely global. Most of the places that I personally am looking at, I'm looking in, well, for now at least, in the US, mostly on the West Coast, Vermont, in some parts of upstate New York, in the whole BC, Western Canada region, all the normal places, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and Oceanics comes on the radar as being, in this new imaginal space of the oceans. I mean, I could go on at length, but the whole point is all the stuff you got to do to actually start founding these things, with a real focus on mostly the big focus right now is on the financial model. Like, what's the actual financial model that can be activated now? Like, it's legible to the existing environment, but doesn't inhibit the actual dynamics of the system so that it can do the thing that it's supposed to be.
So we're closing up on time right now, and it pains me because this is, for our listeners, the nitty-gritty stuff, especially since there was all this amazing content leading up to it that really gives it a lot of content. But I guess to close out, if you have an entrepreneur that wants to use your methodology in order to get it right, what are the first steps they can do to do so?
Well, here's what I've recommended. So many entrepreneurs have talked to me about this. By far, the first step that they could do is they could become aware of and become quite comfortable with what in the psychological literature is known as liminal mind. Right. So you recall that I made the claim the GameB stands in relationship to the whole category of culture, as culture stands in relationship to neurology, to mind, to brain. Well, what that means is all the ideas and constraints that you have on the nature of how you might kind of do these things are probably not going to be perfectly accurate. Right? You're going to have a lot of assumptions, probably sometimes deep assumptions. And if you're trying to run what you're doing from this old code, there's going to be a lot of errors. And the deepest one is actually just a sheer psychology. I wrote an essay called "The Distinction Between Thinking and Simulated Thinking." And simulated thinking is effectively algorithmic. I can run code fast and with precision. And unfortunately, our educational system prioritizes simulated thinking to the maximum, but so in many cases does our entrepreneurial system. I have to actually be able to sort of do a song and dance routine and speak a language to funders that sounds very much like things they've heard many times in the past, but at a high level of excellence, right? It tries to seek for pattern, good pattern, right? To the point that I think many people, and unfortunately many entrepreneurs, have actually lost track of what it means to sort of think clearly, deeply, and creatively about direct relationship with possibility, with reality. And if you can't do that, then you're just not going to be able to interact with what we're trying to do, because by definition, we're trying to do something which is profoundly, profoundly innovative. Again, at the level of more innovative than culture itself. And I mean, I imagine that something on the order of like 99% of your listeners, even when I say what I just said, have a visceral somatic rejection response, some sort of aversion response to that proposition. And in some sense, that's fine. My point is, if you're having a triggered response to that proposition, then everything I'm saying is a waste of your time. Focus elsewhere. If you feel like it is at least somewhat meaningful, you're going to have to get to the point where operating with effective liminality, which is not the same thing as magical thinking or bullshit, but is the space of creativity. Then we can start talking about the next set of stuff, which is, unfortunately, it's a little bit like I'm saying you have to learn how to walk before you can run. And also, by the way, tomorrow I'm putting you in the Olympic 100-meter race. So walk before you can run. And also in a moment, you're going to have to run really fast. But that's the reality.
Excellent. Well, Jordan, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to chew on, and I mean a lot. Thank you so much. And everyone, go check out Jordan's work. He has a YouTube series, and he has plenty of videos and podcasts. Jordan, what is a good place for everyone to see your work?
Yeah, I think the YouTube series was created, super lo-fi, by the way, but both Deep Code and Civium were just created to make this more available. There's a lot of concepts. And if you don't have the toolkit of concepts, a lot of this stuff is going to be very difficult to make sense. It doesn't chew easily. But what I found is that there are many people who have gone through just taking the time to absorb the concepts, and then it starts to flow much more fluidly. It's like learning a new grammar. Once you've got the new grammar, then you can actually start doing poetry.
You heard that? Learn the new grammar, but don't let it be Esperanto.
Don't let it be Esperanto. Yes, right.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jordan.
All right. Bye-bye.